Jake Morrison opened his eyes to a world of pain. His head hurt badly and his mouth felt dry as sand. The ground under him was hard and rough. Sharp rocks cut into his back through his thin uniform. He sat up slowly and looked around. The sky above him was dark purple with two small suns hanging low on the horizon. The air felt thin and cold. Every breath he took burned his lungs a little. This was not Earth. This was nowhere close to Earth. Jake remembered now. The Galactic Survival Council had chosen him to represent humanity in their test. They called it the ultimate challenge for any species that wanted to join their group. 12 beings from different worlds would be dropped on this moon with nothing. No tools, no food, no shelter, no help. He stood up on shaky legs and looked at the other contestants. A few hundred feet away, he saw a huge creature covered in thick armor plates. That had to be one of the Kreks. The thing stood 8 feet tall and had arms like tree trunks. Its skin looked like it could stop bullets. Further away, something that looked like a walking cloud of silver dust moved across the rocks. The Zephyrians were made of tiny particles that worked together as one mind. They could change their shape and float through the air. Near a cluster of black rocks, Jake saw 3 smaller beings working together. They moved in perfect sync, like dancers who had practiced the same routine for years. The collective shared one mind between many bodies. What one knew, they all knew. Jake counted 9 other life forms scattered across the barren landscape. Each species had natural gifts that humans could never match. The Kreks were stronger than 10 men. The Zephyrians could fly and reshape themselves at will. The collective could work as one perfect team. What did humans have? Jake was just a regular guy from Ohio. He had served in the military and learned some survival skills, but nothing special. He was not the strongest or the smartest or the fastest. Earth's leaders had picked him because he stayed calm under pressure and could think through problems step by step. Right now, that did not feel like enough. The landscape around him looked like death itself. Jagged rocks stuck out of the ground like broken teeth. No plants grew anywhere. No water could be seen. The thin air made every breath a struggle. When the 2 suns set, the temperature would drop fast. When they rose again, the heat would be deadly. Jake heard a sound behind him and turned around. A small device floated in the air, watching him with a red light. The Galactic Council was monitoring everything. They would record how each species tried to survive. They would watch as most of the contestants died. The Council had run this test many times before. No species had ever completed it successfully. The moon of Kepler 442c was designed to kill anything that tried to live on it. The Council used it to prove that survival was impossible without their help and technology. Jake started walking across the rocky ground. His feet hurt with every step, but he needed to explore the area before the sun set. The other contestants were doing the same thing. The Kreks was smashing rocks together, trying to build some kind of wall. The Zephyrians were spreading out thin, covering more ground to look for resources. The collective moved in a tight group, their 3 bodies checking different areas but sharing what they found instantly. They had a big advantage in this kind of search. Jake walked toward what looked like an old dried lake bed. The ground here was different. Instead of sharp rocks, he found smooth dirt and something else. Small curved objects were scattered across the area. He picked one up and examined it closely. It was some kind of shell. The surface was hard and smooth, with ridges that formed natural grip points. One end came to a sharp point while the other end was wide and curved like a scoop. It felt solid in his hand, not brittle like he expected. Jake looked around and saw hundreds of these shells spread across the old lake bed. They came in different sizes, from tiny ones that fit in his palm to large ones as big as dinner plates. Most of the other contestants had walked right past this area without stopping. He picked up several shells and tested them. The larger ones were perfect for digging. The curved shape would move dirt efficiently. The sharp ends could cut through roots or packed earth. The hard surface would not break easily. Jake found a hillside near the shell field. The dirt here looked different from the rocky areas. It was more like clay mixed with sand. He pressed his finger into it and was surprised at how easily it gave way. The soil was workable. An idea began to form in his mind. The other species were trying to build shelters above ground, using their natural abilities. The Krex was stacking rocks. The Zephyrians were trying to weave particles together. The collective was gathering materials in organized piles. But what if the answer was not to build up, but to dig down? Jake had read stories as a child about people who lived underground. Hobbits in their cozy holes, ancient humans who carved homes into hillsides. Underground houses stayed warm in winter and cool in summer. They were hidden from enemies and protected from storms. The first sun was getting lower in the sky. Soon, it would be dark and cold. Jake picked up the largest shell he could find and walked to the hillside. He knelt down and pushed the sharp end into the dirt. The shell cut through the soil like a knife through soft butter. Jake smiled for the first time since waking up on this deadly moon. Maybe humans did have something special after all. Maybe the ability to see simple solutions was more valuable than armor or flight or shared consciousness. He started to dig. The shell worked better than Jake had hoped. Each scoop pulled away chunks of dirt the size of his fist. The soil was packed tight enough to hold its shape, but soft enough to dig through. Jake worked steadily, creating a hole in the hillside that grew deeper with every hour. Around him, the other contestants struggled with their own survival plans. The massive Krex had built a wall of rocks 3 feet high, but the structure kept falling down. The creature's huge hands could not place the stones with enough care. Every time it tried to add another rock, 2 others would tumble off. The Zephyrians had spread themselves thin across a wide area, trying to form a protective dome. But the wind on this moon was strong and unpredictable. Every few minutes, part of their cloud-like body would be blown away from the group. They had to keep pulling themselves back together instead of building shelter. The collective worked with perfect coordination, but they faced the same problem as everyone else. The moon offered almost nothing to work with. They had gathered every loose rock and stick within a quarter mile, but it was not nearly enough to build anything useful. Jake kept digging. The shell in his hands had become an extension of his own body. He learned how to angle it for maximum efficiency. The curved, edge-scooped dirt, while the pointed tip could punch through harder sections. The natural ridges on the shell kept it from slipping out of his grip, even when his hands got sweaty. As the first sun disappeared behind the horizon, the temperature began to drop fast. Jake felt the cold seeping through his thin uniform. Around him, he could hear the other contestants making distressed sounds. The Krex was bellowing as the cold affected its joints. The Zephyrians were clustering together in a tight ball to conserve heat, but Jake was already 3 feet deep into the hillside. The earth around him blocked most of the wind. The temperature inside his hole was still cold, but not the bone-cutting cold that swept across the open ground. He kept digging by the light of the stars. The second sun had set an hour after the first, leaving the moon in total darkness except for the alien constellations above. Jake could barely see his hands, but he could feel his way forward. The shell scraped against stone and dirt with each movement. By morning, Jake had carved out a space big enough for his whole body. It was not comfortable, but it was shelter. When the 2 suns rose and began heating the ground, Jake stayed cool in his earthen cave while the other contestants baked in the open air. The floating monitor devices buzzed around each contestant, recording everything. Jake noticed that more of them were hovering near his digging site than anywhere else. The Galactic Council was paying attention. On the second day, Jake expanded his hole into a proper tunnel. He used the large shell to remove big chunks of dirt and smaller shells to smooth the walls. The work was hard and made his muscles ache, but he could see progress with every hour. The Krex had given up on building walls and was now trying to find shade behind large rocks. But the 2 suns moved across the sky in different patterns, and shade was hard to find. The creature looked exhausted and was breathing heavily. 3 of the other contestants were already showing serious signs of failure. A slug-like being from the outer rim had not moved in hours. 2 bird-like creatures were huddled together, their feathers falling out in clumps. Jake could see the rescue drones getting ready to extract them before they died. The collective was doing better than most, but even they were struggling. Their shared mind helped them work together, but they still needed physical resources to build with. They had created a small lean-to shelter using their bodies as supports, but it would not last long. Jake worked through the heat of the day, taking breaks only when he absolutely had to. The tunnel now went 8 feet into the hillside and was tall enough for him to crouch inside. He had learned to cut the dirt in sections, creating smooth walls that would not collapse. The shell had become his most valuable tool. He used the pointed end to mark where he wanted to dig, and the curved end to scoop out the loosened earth. The hard surface worked like sandpaper to smooth rough spots. The natural shape fit perfectly in his hand for hours of work. As the suns set on the second day, Jake made his first major discovery. When he dug deeper into a section of wall, water began to seep through the dirt. Not much, just a few drops, but it was the first water anyone had found on the entire moon. Jake used a small shell to catch the water drops. It took 2 hours to collect enough for a single sip, but that sip might mean the difference between life and death. He carved a small basin into the wall where the water seeped through. Slowly, drop by drop, it began to fill. That night was warmer inside the tunnel than the first night had been in the shallow hole. Jake was protected from the wind and the worst of the cold. He could hear the other contestants outside, making sounds of distress as the temperature dropped. By the third day, 2 contestants had been extracted by emergency rescue. The slug being and one of the bird creatures were close to death. The drone swooped down and carried them away to medical facilities in orbit. Jake's tunnel was now a real shelter. He had carved out a main chamber large enough to lie down in, with a narrower entrance tunnel that helped keep the temperature stable. The water seepage had increased to a steady drip that filled his shell basin twice per day. The other contestants were starting to take notice of his success. The collective sent one of their bodies to observe Jake's digging technique. The Kreks wandered closer to the hillside, looking curiously at the hole that seemed to go on forever, but it was too late for them to copy his approach. They did not have the right tools or the knowledge of how to dig properly. The Kreks tried to claw at the dirt with its massive hands, but only succeeded in causing small cave-ins. The collective attempted to use sharp rocks like Jake used his shell, but they could not make it work efficiently. Jake had learned something important about survival that the other species had missed. It was not about being the strongest or the smartest or having the best natural abilities. It was about seeing opportunities that others overlooked and having the patience to turn those opportunities into solutions. The shell that everyone else had walked past without noticing had become the key to his survival. Combined with human knowledge passed down through thousands of generations, it was proving more valuable than armor or flight or shared consciousness. As the third night fell, Jake settled into his underground home and listened to the sounds of struggle from outside. Tomorrow he would dig deeper and make his shelter even better. He was not just surviving anymore. He was beginning to thrive. By the end of the first week, Jake's underground home had grown into something remarkable. What started as a simple hole in the hillside was now a network of connected chambers that stretched 15 feet into the earth. Each room had a specific purpose, designed with the careful planning that separated human intelligence from simple animal instinct. The entrance tunnel sloped downward at a gentle angle, just like the Hobbit holes Jake remembered from childhood stories. This design kept wind and rain from blowing directly into his living space. The tunnel was narrow enough that he could touch both walls with his outstretched arms, which helped maintain body heat, but wide enough that he never felt trapped. The main living chamber was his masterpiece. Using nothing but shells of different sizes, Jake had carved out a room large enough to stand up in. The walls were smooth and curved, following the natural grain of the dirt to prevent cave-ins. He had learned through trial and error which types of soil would hold their shape and which sections needed extra support. The ceiling was dome-shaped, the strongest architectural form humans had ever discovered. Water that seeped through from above would run down the curved walls instead of dripping onto his sleeping area. Jake had carved small channels in the walls to direct this water toward his collection basin. Behind the main chamber, Jake had dug out a storage room. Here he kept his collection of shells sorted by size and purpose. Large shells for heavy digging, medium shells for detail work, small shells for water collection. He had also found some edible roots and grubs in the deeper soil layers. The cool temperature of the underground space kept them fresh much longer than they would last on the surface. The third chamber was Jake's greatest innovation. He had carved out an air circulation system based on principles he remembered from studying ancient architecture. A narrow shaft angled upward toward the surface, ending in a small opening hidden among the rocks. This created a natural airflow that kept fresh oxygen flowing through his underground home. The system worked perfectly. Cool air entered through the main tunnel entrance and was warmed by Jake's body heat in the living chamber. The warm air rose naturally and flowed out through the vertical shaft. This constant circulation prevented the buildup of carbon dioxide that could kill him in an enclosed space. Jake had also discovered that the shells could be used for much more than digging. The smaller ones made perfect bowls for eating and drinking. Medium-sized shells could be fitted together to create a crude but effective lamp when filled with rendered fat from the grubs he caught. The largest shells worked as excellent seats, when placed curved side down. Outside, the situation for the other contestants had grown desperate. 5 more species had been extracted by emergency rescue drones. The Crex was still alive but barely moving. Its natural armor protected it from physical damage, but could not help with dehydration and starvation. The creature had found no food, and no water in over a week. The Zephyrians were holding together better than most, but they were clearly struggling. Their cloud-like bodies had grown thinner and less coordinated. Sometimes parts of their form would drift away and take several minutes to rejoin the main group. They had found no way to create lasting shelter or locate resources. The collective was down to 2 bodies from their original 3. One member had grown too weak to continue and had been taken away by rescue drones. The remaining 2 worked, together with the same perfect coordination, but they were fighting a losing battle against the hostile environment. Jake felt sorry for them, but he knew the rules of the test. No help was allowed between contestants. Each species had to prove their ability to survive using only their own natural advantages and intelligence. From his comfortable underground home, Jake watched the daily struggles of the other contestants. Through his hidden airshaft opening, he could see them wandering across the barren surface looking for anything edible or useful. They walked right over the shell field every day without understanding what they were seeing. On the 10th day, Jake made another important discovery. While digging a new storage alcove, his shell struck something hard. He carefully cleared away the dirt and found what looked like the remains of ancient creatures that had once lived in the lake. These fossils were rich in minerals that his body needed. Jake had learned to eat things that would have disgusted him back on Earth. Grubs, roots, mineral-rich dirt, and now ancient fossils ground into powder with his shells. His body was adapting to extract nutrition from sources that other species could not even recognize as food. The underground temperature remained stable day and night. While the surface swung from freezing cold to burning heat, Jake's home stayed comfortable. The thermal mass of the surrounding Earth acted like a natural climate control system. He had carved shelves into the walls for storage and even created a small area for exercise. During the long hours when the surface was too hot or too cold for outside activity, Jake could maintain his physical condition in the safety of his underground chambers. The shell tools had become extensions of his own hands. Jake could carve intricate patterns in the walls for both decoration and function. He created handholds and footholds that made moving through the tunnels easier. He carved drainage channels that directed water flow exactly where he wanted it to go. Most importantly, Jake had created something that none of the other contestants possessed: a sense of home. The underground chambers were not just shelter. They were a place where he felt safe and comfortable. The curved walls and carefully planned layout gave him peace of mind that no surface shelter could provide. The Galactic Council monitors spent more and more time observing Jake's activities. Other contests had rarely lasted 2 weeks, and never with a contestant who appeared to be thriving, rather than just surviving. The floating devices recorded every detail of his underground construction project. Jake began to understand that he was not just representing humanity in a survival test. He was demonstrating human capabilities that the Galactic Council had never seen before. The ability to turn simple materials into complex solutions. The patience to build something permanent rather than just seeking immediate shelter. The creativity to imagine possibilities that other species missed entirely. On the 14th day, as Jake expanded his underground home even further, he realized something that would have seemed impossible when he first woke up on this deadly moon. He was not just surviving here. He was comfortable. His underground chambers provided everything he needed: shelter, water, food, storage, and security. For the first time since arriving on Kepler 442c, Jake began to think that he might actually complete this impossible test. The shell that had started as his only tool was helping him build something that could last indefinitely. The hobbit hole of his childhood imagination was becoming reality, carved from an alien hillside with nothing but determination and a simple shell found on an ancient lakebed. 3 weeks into the test, Jake's underground home had become a masterpiece of human engineering. What the Galactic Council had designed as an impossible survival challenge had turned into a comfortable living space that would make many Earth apartments seem crude by comparison. The main living chamber now featured carved furniture that Jake had shaped directly from the solid earth walls. His bed was a raised platform covered with dried grasses he had discovered growing in deeper soil layers. The surface was smooth and comfortable, carved to fit the exact contours of his body. Jake had created a kitchen area with multiple preparation surfaces at different heights. Storage niches held his collection of edible plants, processed grubs, and mineral supplements. He had even carved out a primitive refrigeration system by digging deeper into the hillside where the temperature stayed constantly cool. His water collection system had evolved far beyond the simple basin he started with. Jake had carved an elaborate network of channels and collection pools that captured every drop of moisture from the surrounding earth. During the brief daily condensation periods, his system gathered enough water for drinking, cooking, and even washing. The shell tools had been refined through weeks of use. Jake had learned to modify them for specific tasks by carefully chipping away material or polishing surfaces smooth. He had grinding shells, cutting shells, measuring shells, and mixing shells. Each tool was precisely shaped for its intended purpose. Outside his comfortable home, the survival test was reaching its inevitable conclusion. Only 4 contestants remained active. The mighty Krex had finally collapsed from dehydration and exhaustion, rescued by emergency drones just hours before death. The creature that had seemed so powerful at the start of the test had proven unable to adapt to an environment that did not match its natural advantages. The Zephyrians were barely holding together as a single entity. Their cloud-like form had grown so thin that they could barely maintain cohesion. They drifted across the landscape like smoke, no longer able to actively search for resources or build shelter. The rescue drones were monitoring them closely. The collective was down to their final member. The shared consciousness that had been their greatest strength was now their weakness. When one body failed, part of their total intelligence disappeared forever. The remaining individual was trying to survive alone, something their species had never evolved to do. A crystalline being from the inner planets was still active but clearly failing. Its hard surface protected it from physical damage, but could not help with the lack of food and water. The creature moved slowly across the rocks, its once bright surface now dull and cracked. Jake observed their struggles through his hidden observation points, while continuing to improve his underground fortress. He had expanded the system to include 7 connected chambers, each serving a specific function. The newest addition was a workshop where he manufactured tools and processed materials. In this workshop, Jake had made his most important discovery yet. By heating certain minerals in a fire pit and mixing them with organic materials, he could create a primitive but effective cement. This allowed him to reinforce weak sections of his tunnels and create permanent fixtures that would last indefinitely. The fire pit itself was another marvel of human engineering. Jake had designed a ventilation system that drew fresh air in through hidden openings and expelled smoke through a network of narrow chimneys that emerged far from his main entrance. The design prevented detection while providing perfect temperature control for cooking and material processing. Jake's diet had expanded to include dozens of different food sources that other species had never recognized as edible. He ate certain types of bacteria that grew in the deeper soil layers. He processed mineral deposits into nutritional supplements. He had even learned to cultivate primitive fungal growths that provided essential vitamins. His health was actually better now than when the test began. The constant physical activity of digging and construction had strengthened his muscles. The varied diet provided better nutrition than many people got on Earth. The stable temperature and low-stress environment had improved his sleep quality and mental clarity. The Galactic Council monitors were recording everything with obvious fascination. No previous contestant had ever thrived during the survival test. Most species considered themselves successful if they lasted more than a few days. Jake was not just surviving after 3 weeks. He was building a permanent settlement. On the 22nd day, Jake achieved something that stunned even himself. He had created a completely self-sustaining ecosystem within his underground chambers. Water circulated through his collection, and filtration systems. Food production areas generated more calories than he consumed. Waste processing chambers broke down organic matter and returned nutrients to his growing areas. He had essentially terraformed a small section of the hostile moon, turning dead Earth into a living environment that could support human life indefinitely. All using nothing but shells as tools and human knowledge as his guide. The psychological effect of his success was as important as the physical achievement. Jake felt confident and secure in his underground home. He had proven to himself and to the watching galaxy that human adaptability was something special. Where other species saw impossible challenges, humans saw problems that could be solved with enough creativity and effort. Jake began to understand the true purpose of the Galactic Council's test. It was not really about survival skills or natural advantages. It was about discovering which species had the mental flexibility to adapt to completely new environments. It was about finding races that could thrive in the unknown challenges of galactic civilization. By the end of the 4th week, Jake was the only contestant left active. The Zephyrians had dissipated beyond recovery and been extracted. The collective's final member had collapsed from isolation stress. The crystalline being had grown too weak to move and was taken away by rescue drones. Jake spent his days expanding and improving his underground city. He carved decorative patterns into the walls that reminded him of home. He created recreational areas where he could exercise and relax. He even started working on a primitive library, carving important survival information into stone tablets for future reference. The floating monitors had multiplied around his location. Dozens of recording devices tracked his every movement. Jake knew that his underground home had become the center of galactic attention. Representatives from dozens of species were probably watching his daily activities and learning from his techniques. On the 28th day, Jake received an unexpected message transmitted through the monitoring system. The Galactic Council wanted to know if he was ready to complete the test or if he intended to continue building his settlement. Jake looked around his comfortable underground home and smiled. He could live here indefinitely if necessary. His systems were self-sustaining and constantly improving. He had shelter, food, water, tools, and security. Everything needed for permanent colonization of this hostile moon. But he also knew that his real purpose here was complete. He had proven that humans belonged among the stars not because they were the strongest or the most advanced, but because they could adapt to any challenge and turn it into an opportunity. Jake sent his response through the monitoring system. He was ready to conclude the test and return home. The rescue ship that came for Jake was unlike anything he had expected. Instead of a simple extraction vessel, a massive diplomatic cruiser descended from orbit carrying representatives from the entire Galactic Council. They had not come just to collect a surviving contestant. They had come to witness something unprecedented in the history of their civilization. Jake emerged from his underground home after 30 days in the hostile environment of Kepler 442c. He carried with him only his original shell tool and a small collection of the most useful items he had created. As he stepped into the bright light of the two suns, he looked back at the hidden entrance to his subterranean city with pride. The council representatives were waiting in full formal dress. 12 different species stood in a semicircle around Jake, their various forms of communication devices translating everything into a unified language that all could understand. He had expected maybe a brief interview before returning to Earth. Instead, he found himself facing what appeared to be a formal diplomatic ceremony. The lead council member was a tall, graceful being with silver skin and multiple arms. She spoke in a voice that carried both authority and genuine surprise. Human Jake Morrison. In 300 years of conducting this survival assessment, no species has ever completed the full challenge period. Most fail within days. You have not merely survived for 30 days. You have created a permanent settlement. Jake held up the simple shell that had made everything possible. I had good tools and better knowledge. My species has been learning to survive in difficult places for thousands of years. We just had to remember what our ancestors taught us. The council members exchanged glances that their translator systems could not fully convey. Jake could sense their amazement even across the barriers of completely different biology and culture. What seemed normal to him had shattered their understanding of what survival meant. A floating platform approached, carrying holographic displays of everything Jake had built underground. The council had been recording every detail of his construction project. They showed images of his water collection systems, his food production chambers, his ventilation networks, and his tool manufacturing workshop. These innovations, the silver-skinned leader continued, represent engineering principles that our most advanced civilizations take centuries to develop. You created them in weeks using primitive tools on a world designed to be uninhabitable. How is this possible? Jake thought carefully before answering. He understood now that his words would be analyzed by dozens of species and could affect humanity's future among the stars. Every human child grows up hearing stories about people who survived impossible situations. We learn about building shelters and finding food and working together to solve problems. These stories teach us that there is always a solution if you are willing to work hard enough to find it. The council leader gestured to the holographic displays showing Jake's underground home. Your species calls this behavior normal. We call it miraculous. The Kreks are strong enough to lift 10 tons, but could not build lasting shelter. The Zephyrians can reshape matter at the molecular level, but could not adapt to this environment. The collective shares perfect communication, but could not innovate solutions. You used a simple shell to accomplish what our greatest technologies could not. Jake looked at the representatives of the various species that had failed the test. Many of them had been rescued just before death, their natural advantages proving useless against an environment that did not match their evolutionary history. Maybe that is the point. We humans are not specialized for any one environment. We have to be able to adapt to anything. That means we have to be creative. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything in Galactic Council history. Instead of a simple pass or fail evaluation, Jake's survival had forced them to completely reconsider their understanding of intelligence and capability. They had been measuring species based on their own limited definitions of advancement. The council formally invited humanity to join the galactic community, not as junior members who needed guidance, but as teachers who could show other species new ways of approaching problems. Jake's shell would be preserved in the council archives as a symbol of human ingenuity. His underground settlement would be maintained as a research station where other species could study human survival techniques. But the most important change was in how the council viewed intelligence itself. They had always assumed that the most advanced species were those with the most sophisticated technology or the most powerful natural abilities. Jake had proven that sometimes the most advanced solution was also the simplest and most creative. 1. The journey back to Earth took 2 weeks aboard the Council's fastest diplomatic vessel. Jake spent the time in comfortable quarters, being interviewed by xenobiologists and cultural analysts who wanted to understand how human society had produced someone capable of his achievement. They were particularly fascinated by his references to childhood stories and ancestral knowledge. When Jake finally returned to Earth, he found himself at the center of a celebration that spanned the entire planet. Humanity had not just passed the Galactic Council's test. They had exceeded it so dramatically that the rules of galactic civilization were being rewritten to accommodate human capabilities. Jake returned to his home in Ohio, carrying the same shell that had saved his life on Kepler 442c. News media from across the galaxy wanted to interview him, but he preferred to spend time with his family and friends, telling them about his month underground on an alien moon. His daughter Amy was fascinated by the shell, and begged Jake to teach her how to use it. On a warm Saturday afternoon, they went to the backyard where Jake showed her the basics of digging and construction. Amy learned quickly, her small hands finding the same natural grip on the shell that her father had discovered. "Dad?" Amy said, as she carefully scooped dirt into a neat pile. "Is it really true that this little shell helped you beat all those powerful aliens?" Jake watched his daughter work with the same tool that had changed humanity's destiny among the stars. The shell was important, but the real secret was remembering that there is always a solution. Sometimes you just have to dig a little deeper to find it. As evening fell, father and daughter continued working in the backyard dirt, teaching and learning the skills that had made humans unique in the galaxy. Above them, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Among those stars, dozens of alien civilizations were studying human survival techniques and learning to see their own challenges through human eyes. The simple shell sat in Jake's workshop that night, worn smooth by weeks of hard use on an impossible world. It looked like nothing special, just a curved piece of natural material that anyone might find on any beach. But it had become the symbol of something greater: the human ability to see solutions where others saw only problems, to find opportunity in the midst of disaster, and to build homes in the most hostile places imaginable. Humanity had earned its place among the stars not by being the strongest or the smartest, but by being the most adaptable. And it had all started with a man, a shell, and the willingness to dig deeper when everyone else gave up.